And
Before you said placemaking and transportation are two of the last two that you mentioned in your introduction. So, do you have something to say?
well, in terms of other challenges. I'm glad, thanks for bringing that up. I think it's a very curious
Can you repeat
thing.
that for the folks in the back here?
Would you like to repeat it yourself?
I said initially he had talked about placemaking and transportation as part of the focus of the...
Well, all these are interconnected,
Right.
right? So if you go just to where commuter rail will be going, to the, Pawtucket, Central Falls, et cetera, part of the issue is how do you create denser nodes, particularly in the cores of your cities and towns. So it's like transit-oriented development before the transit. Now you can have rapid bus, obviously, but if you have rail or light rail. And we've seen the 2030 plan that's been out. So part of the issue here for any part of the U.S. is what really both the public wants, but also the innovation economy, advanced industries want to a large extent, is they want multi-use, mixed purpose, vibrant, vital, integrated kind of places from a use perspective. That's generally not how the financial system lends or invests. They tend to go, well, we're going to invest in residential, we're going to invest in commercial, we're going to invest in small business. So you have to work the system here to get that. The placemaking and transportation is both an opportunity and a challenge. We've got some great, nodes, great cores, but to light them up, so to speak, is going to take, again, as with your advanced industry effort, a level of intentionality and purpose. It won't just happen. It has to be catalyzed.
So we're going to go into the public comment section.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Anything else you want to say before we do?
I think I am done. I'm going to go back to the beginning so you see this beautiful first thing.
Great. And just a reminder, we had a sign up as you entered where you could register for public comment if you wanted to do it. If you haven't yet signed up and you want to, we'll keep it open for another couple minutes in the back, so feel free to...
And can I just say one thing?
Yep,
a bunch
please.
of folks who I see in the room have sent me some really helpful comments by LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever social media we're all on. I just wanted to thank you for that. And it's, I've read everything people have sent me, and it's really helpful to get, voices from the field, so to speak, to engage. I really appreciate
your presentation, although you mentioned legacy industries.
I'm going to cut you off, sir. If this is an actual question, then I'm going to...
It's just a question about that presentation.
Okay, I'm going to go through the sequence of questions if you don't mind, sir.
Sure.
So Buff did have a quick clarification, but I'm going to now go through the list. So I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind, did you sign up, sir?
No.
Okay, so Ben, please bring this gentleman a sign-up sheet, and as soon as you complete bringing that over, Ben, I'm going to ask you to set the ground rules.
So for providing public comments, Stefan is going to go through the list of folks who, as they signed in, indicated that they wish to provide public comments. Again, if you haven't done that yet, feel free to reach out to me. I'll add you to the list. The ground rules, since we have so many public commenters tonight, which is great, we're asking that you please keep your comments to 2 minutes or less. In addition to that, if you could start out by stating your name and, if applicable, the organization that you represent.
Perfect. And I've got yeses and maybes in here, and that's perfectly fine. So you have the option to decline to ask a question when I get to you on the list. And I'm going to go in the order in which you signed up. So Neil Emper, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, during your discussion...
Stand up, please.
Neil Amper, Capstone Properties. During your discussion, you mentioned the shortage of appropriate real estate. I'm in the commercial real estate business. And that's a constant problem. It's been this way for decades. And Quonset Point is a good example of how it's successful, but there just isn't enough property to satisfy either a warehouse or a biotech and how do you solve those problems? Because first of all, the rents don't allow us to build on a spec building because people aren't paying the rents. Like 50 miles up the road, they're paying $12 a square foot triple net for warehouse space. I can barely get that for office space on Jefferson Boulevard.
Yeah, this has been a topic for a long time in this state. Quonset's getting built out, right? So there may be some options in Quonset for some repurposing, but that will take a bit of time. One of the things we've been thinking about, coming from some of the European experience, is trying to build off of what the public sector owns. This is much more of a focus in Europe than it is in the US. In the United States, there's many publics. You get the state, you have general purpose municipal or local government, you then have authorities, you then have universities. So there's a lot of land actually that's owned by public, though we don't tend to inventory it, we don't tend to make it transparent. So one thing, as we think through, is Rhode Island out of space? Not necessarily, but there needs to be a very strategic focus. I think some of what the Commerce Department put forward, Commerce Corporation put forward about site readiness in the last legislative session was very smart. And this is a serious issue. So, different kinds of companies require different kinds of spaces, obviously. So I think having greater transparency is really, I think, part of what might put you back on track.
Great. Steve Alquist.
I'm good.
Can you stand, please?
Gillian Finkel.
No.
Hi, I'm Gillian Finkel. I am the principal planner for the city of Central Falls.
Oh, good.
I'm hoping that the plan will include some argument as far as economic development goes for protecting our place. I know we've mentioned it's beautiful, and we talk about placemaking. And I guess I'm thinking about historic preservation specifically, and also preserving farms in open space. Because we are so small, I do feel like some of these things are very fragile, and that if we have this opportunity to make this argument for why it's an economic benefit to kind of preserve these places, I would love to see that included.
Yeah. Look, historic preservation, a lot of this is about, the capital stack, to tell you the truth. I mean, in a state, it gets back to sort of the rent issue. What's the debt side, what's the subsidy side, what's the equity side, however equity gets raised, whether it's through a tax credit or new opportunity zone, market-oriented equity. So this state has to think through the financing, particularly of historic properties, because you don't have the total sort of economic growth on steroids that a couple places to the north have, and therefore the capital stack will look different. So most of these kinds of, particularly on the real estate side, irrespective of what kind of companies occupy these spaces, you got to work the math. And then you reverse engineer the kind of tax or other investments that the government might have to put in. It's as simple as that.
Just a quick supplement on historic preservation pertaining to the adaptive reuse of historic structures, investing in the revitalization of historic structures. I just want to note that a number of the stakeholders in this room have been advocating very valiantly for more resources for these purposes, and we had some momentum and some progress in the last legislative session, so I want to give credit to Scott Wolf and Buff Chase and a number of others in the audience. But we have our workhorse real estate tax credit program, which is the Rebuild Rhode Island tax credit program, which offers a credit up to 20% of project costs and sometimes even more, designed for catalytic projects that will unleash activity in the market. There are some restrictions as to size of project, meaning larger projects in certain categories were the only ones that could be authorized. So we have flexed the rules to allow for smaller historic projects to be eligible, and we have required a streamlined application process for smaller historic properties, meaning you could do it faster and you can undertake smaller projects throughout Rhode Island under this workhorse program. And that's true now, thanks to the governor's proposal being successfully enacted in the General Assembly, again with credit to advocates in this room. So I put the word out because we're about to do an issuance for new applications for that program, and we welcome continuing feedback on how we can do it yet better. But we are well over a dozen historic projects that have been invested in already under our rebuild program, and aim to have much more in store. So to the next question, Arthur Palmer.
Arthur Palmer, AP Enterprise. I carry on two jobs. One, I support the Navy, and the other is trying to produce a new business. My comment is your focus is admirable, but the quality of life piece seems to be, I don't see it fit in there. So if you have a company that wants to get going in here and then the quality of life is not what they expect it to be, they may pack up and leave. My question is where is there a quality of life component that is going to be as an accessory to the building of this program?
Well, I think, to tell you the truth, I think we're in a certain phase here where we spent an enormous amount of time looking at the advanced industry, business support, worker support, and some of the placemaking efforts. So as we get to the final report, it's fundamental. I mean, I think we're in a different kind of competition for talent today in the United States, not just because of unemployment, but because of the structural changes and how innovation occurs. And so it's clearly going to be part of the final effort, and then we will be looking at examples, particularly out of Northern Europe, which we think could be adapted and tailored to this state.
Maya Parrish.
Hi, Maya Parrish, and I'm a community and preservation advocate with no affiliation, just passion for
All things Rhode Island.
Right, and I'm really happy that you brought up preservation, and I want to link preservation and quality of life, because it's not just about the repurposing of historic resources. It's also tourism, and it's also, you know, the incredible nonprofit sector that occupies some of these amazing structures. And I don't want to go in, I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to hand to you a report that was done by Place Economics, Donovan Ripkema, and it's probably a name that you recognize, done with several of the statewide advocates. Last year, there is a chapter on the historic tax credit. I did want to point out, we got slammed, you said it a number of times during the recession, and there are some interesting graphs here where it shows even after we got slammed, Rhode Island was still spiking very high in construction and preservation work because of the historic tax credit. And then it petered out because it was taken away. I just want to hand this to you.
No, I really appreciate that. Thank you.
So, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maya. Lisa Kenickie.
Hi, Lisa Kenickie from the Ocean Community Chamber of Commerce, based out of Westerly, Rhode Island. A couple things. We are particularly interested in the housing stock issue, particularly as it relates to finding adequate space for employees to support our five-star resorts in our community and some of the high-end hospitality industries that need hundreds of employees for just 4 or 5 months of the year. We need dormitory-style housing, and that speaks to working with the local municipalities to think differently about the regulations and zoning and that sort of thing. Also, one of the earlier slides talked about eliminating some sort of outdated or unnecessary laws, kind of looking at things differently. I can give an example of one we're challenged with right now. We have a giant commercial space in our community. It sat empty for years. Finally, they rented a tiny little corner to a church. The problem with that is now all the other individual spaces within that commercial building, which is huge, that want to come in to do a sushi restaurant, a virtual golf business, whatever, it's the 200 feet rule. So even though it's the same, even though they're 600 feet away, or 500 feet away, it's within the same building. And so even though you're leasing a space here, your neighbor, a church who's willing to sign off saying, we don't care if you drink beer and wine, God bless you. These businesses have to get their town zoning to approve it, then the town council has to approve it, then you have to get your state legislators to come up to the State House and beg for enabling legislation, which takes 4 to 5 months. And in the lifespan of a new restaurant, 4 to 5 months of not being able to serve alcohol is ridiculous and an impediment we should be able to solve. So those are the types of
It's
things.
a really helpful example.
Really
If I may suggest, Lisa, because that was so specific, Ben Mays is, in addition to being one of our organizers of this event and the process working with Bruce, he's helping us look at regulatory changes. Obviously, such a change could end up in Bruce's report, but we're leading up to the January start of the legislative session, so if you could get with Ben, it'd be fantastic.
I got more, but 2 minutes ran out.
That's all right. More regulatory changes are very welcome.
Keep
so
it going.
Keep them coming. Anything else you want to say on that?
No, I love it. Yeah.
Neil
I
Stein,
want to be part of that religion.
Neil, you pass. Frank Latore.
I will relinquish my time to my
Okay.
distinguished colleague.
Frank, thank you. Both of you know how to find us. Ken Orthene.
Hi,
Hi, Ken.
I'm wearing a couple hats. One is about 30 years ago, I worked on a project in Wayland Square in order to create a wet lab facility, which went under. Here we are in 2019,
Yeah.
and through a personal medical connection, came across a surgeon who was looking to locate a wet lab in Rhode Island in order to bring the grant. And he couldn't find one. He's now in West Bridgewater, Massachusetts.
What couldn't he find again, could you say?
Wet lab.
So he just couldn't find the lab itself.
Lab
Okay,
itself.
thank you. Okay.
That's one. Number two, if you go to the web and look up community readiness for laboratories, there's a Mass Biotech Council that has researched every municipality. I don't know how far they go, whether to 495, and then they checked on the zoning, they've checked on all the regulatory things, and they determined how ready these communities are for laboratories, whether wet lab or type level 2 labs. That data is not available in Rhode Island.
Okay.
Number three, and I don't know if this has changed, somebody from DEM may tell me. We don't have any virgin properties left. Every property, and Neil is familiar with this, are burdened. In Connecticut or Massachusetts, you do not have to go through DEM process and wait for them to do all their analysis and review. There's a system called licensed site professionals where civil engineers are authorized by the state to go out and do that work on behalf of clients, and they're simply subject to file checks. So what could take years in Rhode Island can take a few months in those states. Lastly, 195 corridor land was envisioned for mixed use. With the exception of Wexford, we're now getting residential. So some of the best sites that we have to go around Wexford, to go around South Street Station, we're going to get an apartment building. That's not a good use of that real estate.
These are just superb comments, so maybe we can just huddle after. I want to just make sure I have the right citations for some of this so we can sort of look at it. And look, 195 is really like a calling card for this state, and it's really important to get it right because there's about 100 of these innovation districts that are true innovation districts in the United States and around the world. None of them sit on a riverfront like that. So you got some real possibilities here. But thinking through both the innovation trajectory of that area and also its mixed useness, so to speak, is really important. And we're spending a bit of time on that in this effort. So.
I mean, downtown in the Druid District to the south, purpose of relocating 195 was to knit those together. So you don't have to have those things inside this narrow strip of land.
Yeah, this is a major focus of ours. we'll,
On the wet lab point, just a notation, which is that there has been active work on developing a plan, an implementable plan for the establishment of wet labs. And there's a group, Rhode Island Bio. I don't know if there's any representatives in the room as of this moment. Actually, Jay is here. And pardon me? Marvelous, look at this. Patrice is here again, my goodness, and Carol's here. So raise your hands once again. So our partners at Rhode Island Bio have been advocating vigorously for this. Carol and Patrice and Jay have. And there's active work pertaining to specifically locating such a complex in some form in the Jewelry District, the 195 Innovation and Design District. So we'd welcome, Ken, your interest is always extremely welcome, and we'd love to continue the dialogue. Bruce has already offered that, and others who might be interested in pursuing that further. Christian Cowan.
oh, yeah, you see it.
Stephen Rodriguez.
Also.
Okay, thank you. Alan Krinsky.
Hi, I'm Alan Krinsky. I'm a senior policy analyst with Rhode Island's Economic Progress Institute. In 2017, the United States Chamber of Commerce Foundation came out with a report called Workforce of Today, Workforce of Tomorrow, the Business Case for High-Quality Childcare, where they point out that the lack of access to high-quality childcare has led to problems including decreased labor force participation, increased absences, increased turnover, decreased productivity. And so I think there that we need to have this as part of a strategy. I'd hope to see in the final document that something like investing in high-quality childcare is part of the strategy. Along with that, you mentioned earlier that there are not sufficient wages and benefits for a lot of working people. I think there are other things that could be part of the strategy. Our neighbors in Connecticut and Massachusetts are on a path to $15 minimum wage, which is a living wage. We could join them on that path. Rhode Island's been a pioneer in family leave policy, but we could even strengthen that. So I think for things like the child care, wages, other benefits, I would love to see those as part of the final document of the strategy of how we have a sort of broadly prosperous Rhode Island.
Yeah. I think those are excellent comments. I spoke to the head of the your HHS today about many of these topics, actually. So, and we'll continue to work with her and others because we have to think this through. And again, to have 300,000 people in the state who are receiving public benefits, 90,000 which are receiving food stamps, this has to be part of any economic strategy. So, we started focusing on advanced industries, but so we'll continue the dialogue with her and commerce and beyond. So, thanks for that.
Great. Senator Sam Bell.
Would it be possible if we could go back to the unemployment slide at the beginning?
Yeah.
While we're doing that, I have to start and talk about what is, I think, an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people in this room, but it's about ethics. What? Ethics. It was reported by the Boston Globe about a month ago that this particular contract to develop our economic development plan was receiving private funding. As a state senator, if I took hundreds of thousands of dollars in private money, especially from interested parties, to develop policy, it would be illegal. Now, because policy making has been privatized here, the code of ethics does not apply. But I submit that the same principle does. One of the things that was reported that there's a New York foundation that pushes certain corporate policies that had committed $100,000. But it was also reported that there were conversations with the Partnership for Rhode Island and both the Newport and Providence Chamber of Commerce to commit funding that would ultimately go to pay new localism advisors and Bruce Katz personally. And when people are paying your salary, it affects the decisions that you make around policy. And I think that the ethics principles that guide not taking money from corporate interests, and the Chamber of Commerce and the Partnership for Rhode Island are the most powerful corporate lobbying groups in this state, not taking money from corporate interests it's really important. because this economic plan matters. The economic policies we put in place matter. And corporate interests have an interest. And the reason I wanted to go back to that slide is you can see the results. Because before we implemented these corporate policies, our unemployment rate was plummeting relative to the national average. And once we implement these policies, once they start to bite, they're implemented largely at the beginning of 2015, we see it stall. And that means people in my district suffering because of the economic damage. And all throughout this conversation, we have focused primarily on one subject. We focused all on microeconomics. The economy is not driven by one particular business deal or one particular regulation. That's what business leaders, what a lot of the people in this room see. The economy is driven by the real economy, though. It's driven by stimulus, it's driven by aggregate demand. And the decision that was made that hurt this economy most was to pay for those tax cuts, to pay for those business incentives. We eviscerated Medicaid. We lost tons of federal money. And that is where the multipliers are biggest when every robust academic study does it and looks at where the multipliers are largest. It's on programs like Medicaid. And when we slashed those funds, we eviscerated our state's economy. And yes, it hurt business too. The nursing home in my district that shut down is a business. The hospitals that are getting bought out by out-of-state corporations, that are laying off staff, that are experiencing massive labor strikes, and in one case shutting down, those are businesses too. And the hospitals that are going to shut down will cost thousands and thousands of jobs if we don't do something about this. Investments in Medicaid are crucial. And when we cut them, when we eviscerate the aggregate demand in our economy, the effects ripple. And we see things like that. So, I am hoping a couple of things. One, I'm hoping the Chamber of
Please
Commerce...
conclude your comments with your final set of statements, if you would.
Yes.
You're at the end of your 2 minutes.
Thank you so much. I'm hoping that the Chamber of Commerce will have the integrity to not put up cash, to not exploit this privatization loophole in the Code of Ethics. And the same with the Partnership for Rhode Island. And I hope that if they do, you'll have the integrity to return it. And finally, I hope that if we start thinking about this, instead of thinking about corporate policy, instead of thinking about corporatist changes to microeconomic policy, we do something about aggregate demand, we do something about macroeconomics so that we can actually grow our economy and so that the graph doesn't look like that. The line goes back and starts rising relative to this country as a whole instead of stagnating from rapid growth.
Well, look, I've been working in this field for 30 to 35 years, and I do my work independently, objectively, so I am offended if you think that any investment in work I do has any effect on my ultimate conclusions and findings. If you want to have a conversation about what drives economic growth from an inclusive perspective, sustainable perspective, innovative perspective, happy to have that conversation. But I've been working in this field for 35 years. And I will stand by everything that I've done. So do not make an accusation like that without any evidence whatsoever.
Do you deny that
This is not a back and forth, Senator, but we would welcome a sidebar as we've expressed for other people on other subjects. So it's not a back and forth, but thank you, Senator.
Okay.
Appreciate it very much. This is the phase in the Q&A when we open it up for new questions from other participants who did not have the chance to sign up. And we'll do this for about another 10 minutes.
Just a quick statement. Back in 1992, I'm sorry?
Stan.
And just introduce yourself to folks.
Oh,
Stand up.
Joseph Paolino Properties. Back in 1992, under the Governor Sutherland's administration, we had, Bill Warner did a plan on what Ken Orthene was talking about with biotech space in the 195 area. That plan's going to be somewhere in economic development. My suggestion is to try to find that, because it was a major announcement that Governor Sutherland gave, talking about how he wanted the state to be very competitive in the early 90s. And Bill Warner, who moved the rivers and who moved the 195, and he was the architect of that, was also the architect of putting together this plan with biotech wet space in that 195 area. My suggestion is, And a great expansion would be if we could ever get rid of those scrap metal yards and strip clubs on Allen's Avenue, and let that be a great expansion of the 195 area. When we're short for land, that's a great area to go to.
Other new questions from anyone in the audience? Yes, please.
Thanks.
Please name and
Yeah, I'm
identify.
Leslie Kelly, I'm a taxpayer.
Could you please stand so we can hear your question? Thank you.
A couple of things. Accusations notwithstanding, you had a comment about $5 triple net and $15 an hour minimum wage. Those are all macro issues, and those are related.
Right.
Okay, those are related, and that's an issue. But my question is, as Stefan pointed out at the beginning of this, that phase 2 was going to make a concerted effort to address the legacy industry problem. In your presentation, word none about the legacy industry problem. So you're going to, in the Brown tradition, you're going to wait till the night before you get that in the report? What's your thinking about legacy industries in the context of what's going on?
There were several slides, and there's quite a few more that I cut out, or else this would have been a typical Brown lecture, and we would have been here to midnight. But I think what we're trying to work through, the entire team, partly is around the real jobs effort going forward. Because it's so critical to think about not just company-driven demand, which really has been the initial focus, not just of real jobs, but innovation vouchers, and that can be defended, but cluster-driven focus. So if we start thinking about clusters in non-advanced industries that obviously are not paying sufficient wages and benefits, but potentially with the upgrading of skills of workers could see a premium effect. That's what we're trying to work through for the final report. So a lot of focus on the labor supply side, a lot of focus on real jobs, and frankly, not just real jobs, but the whole continuum of schools and skills, because CTE in the high schools, CCRI, we'll be talking with the president of CCRI, and then on. So we've taken this very seriously, and we're trying to source the best examples, whether it's in other parts of the United States, whether it's in Europe, to try to respond to this. So and your comments at the prior hearing were very helpful to this review. So I think you should expect the final report will include multiple recommendations on this front.
Maybe one or two more questions from new questioners. Buff.
Buff Chase, Corpus Associates. So you mentioned the ocean state, which is mostly a good thing, except when it comes to climate change.
Right.
And resiliency.
Yeah.
So I think that we need to include that conversation somehow in this. I just wanted to bring it up as an important area, both in terms of how do we organize around that, and how our allocation of resources change in the face of this.
I mean, this is the good part about having European partners on the team. There's a whole series of nature-based solutions that are coming out of Holland, that are coming out of Northern Europe, that we think could be adapted to Rhode Island. Nothing ever goes one-to-one, to tell you the truth. If you're going to be the blue economy state of the U.S., like the Dutch are in Europe, then we think this could be an area that could be piloted, innovated, both on the content side and on the finance side. We've been lagging here, let's just be clear. I mean, and it's coming. So flooding, third biggest exposure in the United States is flooding. I mean, on the liability side. The first two are really Medicare and Social Security, but the third is flooding. It's coming.
I saw one more hand in the back and then one hand in the front, and that will be the conclusion, sir.
Good evening. I'm Kurt Spalding. I'm at your esteemed institution. I'm with the Institute for Environment and Society at Brown.
Oh, great.
And formerly EPA regional administrator, so I have a sense of regional view. Building on something Buff said, but I want to follow up on the blue tech concept that you're starting to talk about. Maybe you could fill in the gaps a little bit. when you talk about Smart Bay, previously I ran Save the Bay for 18 years. So I have a pretty good sense of that ecosystem and how that works. Do you see this as a Rhode Island play or a regional play? We have so much around us in blue tech that is somewhat divorced from the economic engine to the north. If we connect the Cape to, I always like to connect New London around to Woods Hole. If you could comment on that. And then the other build-on point that I bring forward is, interestingly, Rhode Island's land use pattern got decentralized like everywhere else with suburbanization. And our barrier really protected the Rhode Island that was, where the economic engine was behind the barrier, but now the economic engines are outside the barrier to some degree. New localism sits on a chair in my office, which I give to students from time to time to try to understand how these dynamics work. Could you describe what might happen when we have to remake place around those issues?
These are great questions. So I would say on the blue economy, a portion of it is regional, obviously. A portion of it, I think, is highly concentrated in this state. There's only one Newark, right? I mean, and if you have one of these advanced military research facilities, particularly one like Newark that's examining autonomous vehicles underseas, there may be some substantial commercialization potential there. Not easy always to do, but it's there. And then URI, oceanography, there's only 7 of these in the US, right? So you've got a concentrated position here, in addition to some of the broader issues that affect the broader region. Multi-state collaboration, you think multi-municipal collaborations are multi-state, comes to ebb and flow. We're going to have to reimagine a very different future in our coastal communities. And I think, again, the US is lagging substantially here. But there's enough effort, particularly in some of the leading Northern European countries and other parts of the world, that whichever part of the US, and we've got 2 major coastlines, that decides it wants to be a first mover on innovative practice, not so much product, but practice, could find themselves with, obviously helping maintain and preserve, right? But also providing an export service. I mean, that's what the Dutch, the Danes, and that's what they're doing in Northern Europe. They see where the world's going, and they want to occupy a space. And they'll be providing either products or consultancies for a long time. So this field is open here. And you have certain chops, besides just being called the ocean state, so it's nice, alliterative kind of branding. I mean, you have certain chops that probably have not been leveraged to date, but could be. And I will say, with regard to offshore wind, you have the focus of Northern Europe. Not only do you have the focus, you have their investments, right? And therefore, there's potential to deal with some of the biggest FDI, foreign direct investors in the world, in the United States, by showing that that was just not a one-off, but that you're really applying this across the board.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Larry Warner with United Way of Rhode Island. I want to say thank you very much for tonight's presentation and the opportunity to comment. I also want to say thank you for pointing out that the trend line here and where we are today is not reflective of all the experience of all communities in the state, and that we do need to be intentional in making sure that minority communities are not left behind in the turnaround. I look forward to examples of how other communities are being intentional in their investment. But I also want to encourage that these types of conversations are, that we make sure that they're accessible to the communities that are still on the turnaround. And so if there's any opportunity, Secretary, for United Way to be a partner in making sure these conversations are accessible, we would welcome that opportunity.
Thank you for that offer. We will partner with you. We appreciate that very much.
Thanks for the comments.
And thank you for your partnership on multiple dimensions. A great deal of our work. Really, really appreciate it. All right, thank you. We've reached the end for the program this evening. We will be here to answer individual questions, and we look forward to future sessions.